Hello. There has been a deliberate attempt across the Western world to intimidate those standing with the Palestinian people, those opposing, obviously, the great atrocities currently being committed. What's actually very perverse about that is this form of McCarthyism has targeted Jewish people, for example, in the name of protecting Jewish people. The world has been turned completely upside down. Now, with that in mind, I'm really delighted to be joined again by Tomer Dotan-Dreyfus. We talked actually back in October, not long after all this particular round of intense horror began. He's a brilliant German-Israeli writer. He's been involved in the peace movement in Germany. And what's happening in Germany is, I think a lot of people think it's particularly extreme, and it is, but it is symptomatic of what's happening in many different countries. So, Tomer, it's great to be joined by you again. Hello.
Hi, hello. Thank you for inviting me again.
I want to talk to you about a new development, I guess, which I think really is a warning, actually. And it centers, for those who don't remember, there was a definition on anti-Semitism, which was formulated by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The actual top definition itself, the actual key definition, I think, is something no one really had an objection to. I think various Jewish scholars who didn't think it was particularly, it didn't go into the proper detail of anti-Semitism, but it had a series of examples, and two of them related to Israel. Do you want to talk about what's happening with that in mind? I just wanted to give a preamble about what we're talking about there. In terms of what the government, the authorities are planning in Germany. And hello again, by the way.
So, so what happens recently is that in the state of Berlin, the cultural ministry has decided to make it mandatory for artists and cultural workers to sign a certain clause agreeing to the guidelines of this definition. This definition has been weaponized and instrumentalized many times in the past by right-wing governments, far-right organizations and groups to tackle or to silence pro-Palestinian activists, solidarity with Palestinian movements. And this has come so far that even the person who actually drafted this definition of anti-Semitism has came forward in The Guardian 4 years ago and wrote a piece saying, I drafted the definition that the right wing is now instrumentalizing for their agendas. And yet there has been almost no debate regarding this definition in the Berliner Senate. There was no mention of the other option, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, that was drafted in 2019 as an opposition to this one, which, by the way, does not claim that there is no anti-Semitism in these movements, only that you cannot accuse them inherently of being anti-Semitic, which is something that the fans of IRA definition are doing. And what it creates is an atmosphere in which, in Germany, you do rely quite a lot on state funding. So if you don't sign that, and as an artist, and you're not eligible to get state funding, you might lose your livelihood, you might lose your income, you might not be invited to certain institutions to do readings, exhibitions, and so on. People have already been cancelled based on that, exhibitions and events. But because it's a clause and not a law, it creates a situation where these institutes are policing themselves. They can always say, "Oh, we're not really limiting freedom of speech because we didn't make it illegal." But they created a situation where you're just not going to be invited anywhere. So in a way, it's limitation of freedom of speech de facto, but not de jure. Yeah.
So what this does basically is you're an artist, and I should say, by the way, there's loud building work going on, which is why I'm going to try to keep my questions relatively pithy to the delight of my audience, but also I keep silencing myself, which is relevant to the conversation we're talking about people being silenced. But in terms of this artist, this is the issue. So you get we know throughout history, artists often take a political stand. Art and politics are often things which are interchangeable. A lot of people's art is actually about expressing their passion about certain issues in society, always has been. So what this means in practice, artists do rely on state funding, and what they'll do is they'll panic about whether or not their careers, their livelihoods are at risk, so they won't speak out. And if they do, they're threatened with their livelihoods being affected.
Yeah, it creates a huge gray zone in which you don't know if what you're saying is going to cost you your income or not, so you just prefer not to say it. And we've seen this a lot in recent years in Germany, when we look at how language is shifting around this topic, right? There was a decision of the German parliament, the Bundestag, in 2019 on state funding for people who are in proximity of BDS. And they've decided to take this funding away from people. But in this constellation here, we have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of the word proximity? What does it mean? The meaning is we don't have to even prove that you are a member of a BDS group. We can just rely on people who claim that you tweeted something. So it creates this whole atmosphere of spying on your neighbors that is not very fruitful for artists and for cultural workers to live in. Yeah, or for example, a cultural center in the neighborhood of Neukölln. It's a traditionally neighborhood that has a relatively high percentage of Palestinian refugees and other immigrants. And there was a cultural center there that was shut down because of what they referred to as hidden anti-Semitism. By the way, because they agreed to host an event of the Jewish Voice for Peace. So they were accused by the Cultural Ministry of Berlin, hidden anti-Semitism, and their funding was taken away and they had to shut down. And the meaning of hidden anti-Semitism is exactly that. I don't have to prove any anti-Semitism because I'm talking about a hidden one. And so language in Germany is shifting around this topic to a really worrisome degree, I think.
And just so people know, BDS, I'm sure most people do, but it's boycott, directs, and sanctions, which is a movement which models itself on the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. In terms of this, is also about who gets invited to events, doesn't it? So what happens is organisers, maybe a festival or some sort of event, they might invite certain writers and then they get disinvited. And I know lots of writers this has happened to. And so go for it. Sorry.
It happened also before this clause was sealed on Monday. It happened to Adania Shibli, Palestinian author that wrote a novel and won a prize in the Frankfurt Book Fair recently and was cancelled. I think we might have talked about that. It happened to an anthology of Arabic poems translated to German, an event that was cancelled in Berlin. There is a lot. There is even in the meantime an Instagram account called the Archive of Silence, where you can actually go and see all the events in Germany that has been cancelled. Forensic architecture were disinvited from a University of Aachen. Forensic architecture is an organization looking into specific events and looking at them from different angles and different perspectives to determine who done it and how. And they researched, among other things, also the missile on the hospital at the beginning of the war that was unclear if it was Hamas or Israel and so on. So they looked into it and proved with their methods that it was an Israeli bombing. So they got disinvited and so on and so forth. There are many, many examples of that.
I mentioned at the beginning the question of Jewish people who've been speaking out, and throughout the Western world, actually, I mean, you can see this particularly in the US. I would say a generation, particularly of younger Jews, who've I think very much taken part of the leadership of the solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. Yeah. Obviously, there's always been an overrepresentation of Jewish people in movements for liberation and social justice, which is something the far right particularly targeted Jews for in the early 20th century onwards, and that continues to be the case today in movements in support of Palestinian liberation. But many of those Jewish voices are now being targeted by this very McCarthyism, and that is happening in Germany, isn't it? That Jewish people are being targeted in the name of protecting Jewish people.
Yeah, look, the Germany has a very specific image of what Jews are like, or what Jews should be like. That is supporting Israel, maybe with a mild criticism, but not too much, and looking in a certain way. And once you doubt or break this image because of, for example, being too critical towards Israel, or in any other way that they would imagine you'd be, then you're not even considered really Jewish anymore. I had, which is really appalling, how Germans would explain to me, would send me messages and explain to me why the Jewish Voice for Peace are not really Jewish.
Which is anti-Semitic. I mean, that's completely wantonly anti-Semitic, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, of all nations of the world, I think they should be the last ones to determine who's Jewish and who's not, and who has the right to speak for Jews and who's not. But it's in all the state structure. There is only one organization in Germany that is allowed to represent Jews, the Central Committee for Jews in Germany, a very conservative organization, and others just don't have the same status. So if we'd have many Jewish organizations in the UK or in the US, in Germany, there's legally only one, and it's not democratically elected, like the president and the gremium and so on. So yeah, that's where we're at.
I mean, one particularly famous example centers on Masha Gessen, who is a Jewish author of Russian heritage. I think US Russian now, I think, citizenship. But can you just tell me a little bit about that particular example, because it blew up, obviously?
Yeah, so Masha Gessen was supposed to get the Hannah Arendt Prize from the city of Bremen and the Heinrich Böll foundation that is close to the Green Party, a party traditionally on the left of the political spectrum. Debatable, but okay. And the prize was, they decided to cancel at least first the prize, and then they did get the prize, but not a ceremony, because of an article they wrote in the New Yorker where they compared Gaza to Jewish ghettos in the Second World War. And the argument was that this comparison is inappropriate, and we can't have that in our public discourse in Germany. To which they replied that without comparing anything to it, without being able to compare anything to the Holocaust, we are actually taking the Holocaust outside of history, outside of time. And if we set our goal to never repeat it, we have to be able to compare to it in order to realize that it did happen in history, it did happen on this planet, and because it did happen, it can happen again, and we have to identify certain processes that might lead there. So whether one agrees with the comparison or not, I think their argument as to why it should be okay to compare to begin with is quite convincing.
I should also do a quick apology there, because I think just as you got their pronouns correct, Masha Gessen is non-binary and goes by the pronouns they them. I'm not sure if I use the correct pronouns, so just making sure I clarify. That's obviously very important to get that correct. In terms of just the irresponsibility of what's happening here, because anti-Semitism is real, very real, and it is rising. And anti-Semitism is so woven into European culture in lots of ways people aren't often even conscious of. It goes back 2,000 years. And we need to be able to have a term which there was a consensus over what it actually means. It's a matter of life and death. It's a very grave and serious issue. So, I mean, this just strikes me as the height of irresponsibility to have a situation where the term anti-Semitism becomes redefined and is used to shut down legitimate critiques of Israel, and particularly at the moment, the current horror, when actually it should have a very precise meaning, which we all have to agree on, because anti-Semitism is one of the great evils.
Yeah, I think anti-Semitism should be fought against, and I think it's counterproductive to focus on the movements in solidarity with Palestinians at the same time as the far right party in Germany is crossing the 22% in the polls. Just of this morning, people of this party have been caught meeting with neo-Nazis and others, planning a massive deportation of millions of people from Germany once they take power. This is it's crazy. These are news that seem like they've been taken from the end of the 1920s. Where they just planned on what's gonna happen when they take power. But when you look at the polls, this is not very far-fetched. They are second biggest party in Germany, 14 points above the SPD, the German Labor, and this is a threat. Anti-Semitism from the right wing is an actual threat to our livelihoods and to our being in Germany. And at this time, to put a focus on people mourning their families and friends who are being killed in Gaza is more than irresponsible. The idea that this is protecting Jews, an idea that unfortunately a lot of Jews actually also believe in, is bizarre to me, I have to say, because one day this is going to be over. It's only a question of time, but obviously there going to be eventually a ceasefire, and we are going to see all the pictures and all the horrors and all the videos from Gaza that are not being released now. And on this day, the world is going to realize what has happened, and we don't want the struggle against anti-Semitism to be connected with justifying those horrors. I don't think it's going to be good for Jews. And this is obviously just a secondary worry because I'm worried about what's happening in Gaza. But that's a topic we're talking about.
Well, no, it's important. I mean, obviously, it's still very important to talk about. I mean, just on that, in terms of the world turned upside down. I mean, well, we can see, can't we, the regime of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which behaves in a gratuitously anti-Semitic way, wages a blatantly anti-Semitic campaign about censoring George Soros, the Hungarian-born Jewish financier, on the basis that he's this kind of sinister Jew pulling the strings of the opposition, and at the same time is a close ally of Israel, and therefore can say, well, actually we're not. How can we be anti-Semitic? We're big allies of Israel,
and adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, as well as the Trump administration and so on.
I mean, on that, I think it's such an important point you make about just the world turned upside down and how dangerous that actually is, because the far right is on the rise everywhere. There's every chance, by the way, Donald Trump will be back in the White House at the end of this year, which will be a huge boost for far right forces. But across the, in Austria as well, the far right are leading in the polls. In France, you cannot rule out the idea of Marine Le Pen becoming president in the next election. Every election, she gets closer and closer. We can see in, all over Europe, various far-right formations. So we end up with a situation where the claim is, well, the real racists, the real anti-Semites, the real threats to Jews are those on the left, those who stand in solidarity with Palestine, including Jewish people, instead of any focus on the far right, including in Germany itself, which I think maybe we could learn one or two lessons from the experience of the far right, where the far right party is on the march. Everyone should be focusing on that threat, and instead we're talking about the left being the dangerous racists.
And we've seen that happening. We've seen that happening in this country, where the far right was organizing and getting ready to take control in quite practical, was having already practical plans, and parliament and politicians were pointing a finger at communists and saying, well, they are the problem. Look at them, look at what they're doing. We've been in this movie before, we've seen it, and I just wish it doesn't end the same way it ended last time that it happened.
Just finally on that, the German state was responsible for the biggest crime committed against the Jewish people ever. I mean, obviously, it was the culmination of many centuries of horrible anti-Semitic, violence, pogroms, and blood libel, and all the rest of it, which Jews suffered for many centuries in many different European countries. But it really was obviously the culmination of all of that. 2/3 of European Jews exterminated. And as well, and I'm not saying this because I believe in collective guilt. Collective guilt is a very dangerous thing to believe in. You should never believe in it. So I don't mean in terms of acting upon this, but it is a historical fact that most of the German people, historically, the research suggests, knew about the Holocaust when it was happening. Now, as a consequence, the German state has said, we have a specific historical responsibility because of what happened in World War II. And in a sense, you can't argue with that. I mean, you can see that you should act if you're going to, if you're going to be responsible as a state for such a unbelievably horrendous crime, then you should draw lessons and act on them. But it's what they've done, I would argue, or lots of people would argue, is say, well, we're going to make other people pay the price for what the German state did. What do you think about that?
I think they are very good in remembering and reparations, as long as they don't really have to pay the price for it. They are not the one that have to give up land. They're not the ones who have to. Even when they gave money, even in the reparations agreement from the 50s, it was money to Israel so that Israel can buy weapons and infrastructure from the German industry. Was boosting the German industry. And in return, Israel promised them that the Holocaust survivors in Israel would not be eligible to sue Germany independently. So it was a very messy, very dirty deal. And they are, on the one hand, presenting themselves as world champions of memory and memory culture and all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, they have turned memory culture into the realm through which they can find their nationalism again. German nationalism today is around supporting Israel. It's around this historical responsibility and their interpretation of it. And one could also say that, because it's not very legitimate to manifest German nationalism after the Second World War, they're doing it through Israel. They're waving the Israeli flags. Because Israel is the country of the victims. So how can they be wrong?
I think it's really powerful stuff. And as we discussed, I think obviously things are particularly extreme in Germany at the moment, and we need to be calling this out. I do think it's the world in which we live. The real dangerous, hateful extremists are those who oppose a mass slaughter, and the people of moderation are the ones who support a mass slaughter, which has killed at this point over 10,000 children, let alone so many other innocent civilians. But it's so important that we talk about this, and you're the voice of people like yourself, Tom, is so important right now. And you speak with such. People are going to get sick of me using this term because I keep using it in practically every video I do. But moral clarity, and moral clarity is so important at a time like this. It really is. And you've spoken with huge moral clarity, which I hugely appreciate. So please, for those watching or listening, whatever medium you're watching this or listening on, please like. Subscribe, share this video. But Tomer, as ever, thank you so much for your voice.
Thank you very much for having me.